Welcome to the Clarity Podcast, where we inspire listeners to live a life by design and not by default. Today, I'm honored to welcome Brian, an author and a blogger who is known for his Get Out of Your Head series, which focuses on individuals managing anxiety and depression through clarity, mindset, and actionable strategies. Brian's journey through his own mental health challenges had led him to develop a framework that helped others break through their mental clutter and reclaim control over their lives. His mission is to provide practical tools and steps to empower people to simplify overwhelming thoughts, reframe limiting beliefs, and take small, intentional steps towards growth. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks, David. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Brian, your personal journey through anxiety and depression inspired you to write Get Out of Your Head series. Can you share how clarity has played a role in transforming your mindset and life?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there, right? I guess to answer the actual question is, how did clarity kind of impact my own life, right? Is when I think about mental health and when I think about anxiety, I think about the fact that anxiety is a product of uncertainty, right? So if we're feeling uncertain about certain things, whether it's our relationships, our jobs, our status in society, we're going to ask ourselves questions, right? And those questions are going to breed doubt and fear and that sort of thing. And alongside those feelings, or even synonymized with those feelings, comes anxiety, right? So in my life, I noticed from an early age, I had a lot of questions, right? I'd say, oh, how am I going to achieve this goal? How am I going to go do this thing when I don't know? I don't feel as though I have the skills to accomplish it, right? And I noticed that pattern keep coming up of essentially having uncertainty and not having the clarity, and realizing that as a product of that, I needed to go and do a lot of work on myself and learn a lot of new things and figure out how to deal with my own anxiety, my own depression. Eventually, right through many years of work and research and introspection, I eventually turned around and realized that I had made some progress for myself with both of those conditions. And as a product of that, I wanted to turn around and share the insights that I had gleaned with other people, because I knew the journey that I had been on towards clarity and towards, mental health, mental healing. It was such an important part of my life. And when I looked at other folks and said, oh man, like I can see some of the struggle that I went through in them. And I know a little bit, I don't know their exact story, but if we take the commonality of the pain, right, associated with anxiety and mental health struggles, I know how difficult it is to go through that sort of stuff. And so to then connect with folks and say, hey, again, don't know your whole story, but I know the commonality of the pain. And I know that pain is really difficult to go through at times. So I want to try to help you in some capacity, whether that's, having you read one of my books, working with you in one-on-one coaching, or just providing, a nice little conversation between two good friends. So that's kind of the journey in a nutshell. There's obviously a lot of twists and turns in there, but I'll keep it high level for the moment.
That's awesome. Like you said, you've gone through the journey, and what I'm hearing is you're a guide from the side. And the difference between an advisor's or a travel agent or a guide is a travel agent says, hey, go over there, go visit. These are nice places. A guide said, hey, let me walk with you on this journey. Now I'm curious, what was the catalyst for Brian to say, okay, I'm experiencing this, but I no longer want to experience it? And what was that pivot for you?
Yeah, I mean, that actually came pretty early on in the journey. And I would say like the desire to make the pivot was present from not day one, but again, early on. The problem was I had that desire to make the pivot. I didn't know how to make the pivot. And so the story that I tell that often comes up in my writings and, just a common story is I went off to college. When you go to college, I think a lot of people have different ideas of what it's going to be like. And I decided, I'm going to go make a bunch of new friends. I'm going to, make a girlfriend, meet a girlfriend, like eventually get married. I knew that in high school, I had struggled with these various topics, anxiety, depression, mental health, all that. And I was like, let's see if we can put those struggles behind us when we go off to college and just start this brand new life, right? And it was like a couple weeks into school, I had met this girl that I had taken a liking to and seemed like she kind of liked me. And, because of the mental health challenges I had been through, and specifically, I had been on a date in high school with a girl that I liked and had a panic attack in front of her. And that was a very transformative and scary experience, right? That memory, that experience stuck with me. And so I went to college really hoping to put all of that behind me. And yet it's really hard to do that if you don't have the skills, you don't have the requisite knowledge, right? And so A couple weeks into college, I have another panic attack, albeit in front of a different woman that I liked. And that was the moment where it was like, man, things are not going well here, right? Like dating and intimate relationships are an important part of my life, and yet I'm doing really poorly with them. And I don't know how I'm going to succeed in this field. In fact, like I'm experiencing quite a bit of pain related to intimate relationships, right? Where in this moment, the one in college, this girl that I liked she had texted me and said that she was coming over, and I was excited, but also super nervous. And as soon as she got there, she had been drinking a little bit, and it's not to speak poorly of her, just kind of relaying the facts. She's a good person. I still know her, but she came over, like kind of jumped into my lap, immediately felt that I was like, my heart was racing and I was kind of sweating and shaking and stuff, freaked out, ran away, called me all sorts of names. And again, it's not to speak poorly of her. It's about me, and realizing in that moment of like, wow, that was so much pain for an 18-year-old to experience in the face of like, hey, this person that I like is coming over and I hope that it goes well. Meanwhile, or, a couple minutes later, it goes pretty much as poorly as it could go. I woke up the next morning just in a complete like fog and having no idea where I was, right? And I was like, that was so painful yet again. How am I supposed to move forward here? And I just tore apart, my computer, the internet. I mean that metaphorically, right? The next day I was so eager for answers, and I was so eager to just find a new way forward that was the moment where I said, I need to make a pivot, but I don't know how I'm going to do that. And I think one of the sad, maybe frustrating things, right, is like, we all experience a problem and we kind of live in this society where we want an instant solution. And I'm not telling folks that like, hey, anxiety is a battle for your entire life. It doesn't need to be. But given where I was at that time, I wanted the anxiety to go away overnight. The ironic piece was it took me, about a decade of researching, doing introspection, trying out different tactics myself, and getting that base of knowledge and getting that experience to then be able to say like, I understand what anxiety is now. I understand what fuels it. I understand what helps alleviate it. And then finally, after that 10-year period of really working hard on this topic and working hard on myself, I look back and I was like, hey, I'm not perfect. I'm still a human. I still have my own struggles. We all do. But I've made a lot of progress with this condition. And so again, the funny thing to me was I wanted to make that pivot that second week in college. The funny part is I probably didn't really make it until a decade later. And that's when I started getting into the content and writing my books. But I don't know, I was committed to the path, and so I kept walking it.
That's profound. And thank you for sharing that moment of vulnerability of college and having that experience. I could only imagine like in that moment what it felt like. But the fact that you decided to use that pain as a curiosity path, right? Versus use that pain and become a villain. And I believe that the difference between heroes and villains are the decisions that they make. Both experience trauma. One says, I never want to feel this way again, and I don't want others to feel this way. They become the hero, and the villain is, I've experienced this pain and I want to inflict this pain on others. One of your core messages is simplifying the overwhelming noise and anxiety of depression. What are some steps someone can take to cut through the mental clutter and regain control?
Yeah, there's so much that we could unpack, right? I think one thing how I want to simplify this down is thinking about like what anxiety is and then what's going on in your mind and what's going on in your brain and trying to get some of that clarity, right? So if we're focusing on just anxiety itself for now and not depression, right? We could say that anxiety is essentially future-oriented fear. So we all know what fear feels like, right? If you're in a haunted house, you're looking around every corner and worrying that somebody or something is going to pop out at you, and God knows what is going to happen as a result of that, right? Maybe you'll scream, maybe you'll run away, but you are in a heightened state, right? You're scared. Anxiety is essentially that without the threat in front of you. So when I say future-oriented, right? It's something off in the distance, off in the future that isn't necessarily in front of you today. So instead of being in a haunted house, you are worried about being in a haunted house or the proverbial equivalent of that a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, right? And so then if we step back and we say, that's anxiety, then what is happening in our minds, right? To answer that question, I mean, most folks who are listening who have dealt with anxiety know this one intimately. what's going on inside your brain and inside your mind is your thoughts are racing, negative thoughts are popping up, negative questions are popping up. And so there's a lot of noise in your head, right? And if you think about like kind of where anxiety comes from, why does it exist in the body? To just keep things very simple, I would say it's a survival mechanism, right? So the reason why we worry that in a month something negative is going to happen to us is because on a subconscious level or on a survival-based level, we want to see that threat and then potentially make some corrective action that will help us avoid it, right? So if we are worried about being in that proverbial haunted house a month from now, what our brains and what our minds are trying to walk us through is saying, hey, if I approach this in a different fashion, could I avoid the potential pain associated with that? If I don't go there at all, could I avoid the pain associated with that, right? And the difficulty with anxiety and the fact that, it's future oriented is the fact that because our thoughts we've got our survival mechanisms that are really pushing us into a high gear, and then as a product of that, are spinning all this negativity and all these questions into our minds, there's so much noise, right? There's all these what ifs running around our brain saying, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if I do this? What if I react in that fashion? All of that is really noise, right? When we come back and we say, if anxiety is a product of our survival instincts, and our survival instincts are trying to protect us, then in theory, and obviously this is much easier said than done, and it's not our fault, this is just kind of how the body and the mind work, but we should kind of say to ourselves, if there is actually a threat in front of us right now, then we take action against it. And if there is not, then we find a way to say to our brains, hey, thanks for all the messages, thanks for the negativity, thanks for all the questions, but these are not actually helpful right now. And so what I often say to folks, right, is like, let's make this a little more concrete. And we say that we're in school, we have a math exam next week, and we are anxious about it. The anxiety, right, is in our minds is saying, what if I fail? What if I don't get into my dream college as a result of that? What if everybody makes fun of me? What if, the teacher calls me out in the middle of class? Even though those are questions that are semi-reasonable, right? Because we don't want those things to occur. They are not present today, right? And they're not actually helping us achieve anything in this moment. So what I say to folks is, look at all of those questions as noise. Figure out what the underlying message is behind them. See if there is action that you can take as a result of the message that you come up with. And then if you can, take that action. And if you can't, find a way to distract yourself from that noise in your head. Or thank your mind and thank your brain for that noise, and then try to move on in any way that you can, right? So again, I'm trying to be concrete. Let's go back and say, we've got that math exam, our brains are driving us crazy, our minds are driving us crazy. We say, hey, my brain is trying to tell me that I might fail or I might get a grade that I don't like in this situation. With that message, what action could I take, right? The actions could be, I'm going to go study the material some more. I'm going to take a practice exam and prepare myself for the real thing. I think in that situation, those are kind of the two realistic and those are probably the two most reasonable actions that you could take. I think everything else is sort of, superfluous, where it's like, right, we're trying to stay on task and related to the actual fear, the actual exam, not some other topic. So from there, it's like, okay, why don't you try to pull out your textbook, do some studying? Why don't you try to pull out a test exam guide or whatever, take some practice, do some practice questions, take a practice exam. Once that is done, see how you feel. Is your brain still telling you, hey, all these negative things are going to happen? Is your brain still asking you all these questions? If it's not, then great, you've kind of appeased things for now. And if it is, you have some evidence to say to yourself, hey, the questions that my brain is still asking me, those are kind of irrelevant now. They're not necessarily as true as they were before, because I feel as though I've done the work to go get that grade that I want to get. And so it's trying to just, put a little bit more evidence behind your actions and allow yourself to say to your brain, I appreciate the messages of fear, I appreciate the concern, but I think we're good here, right? And I guess I just want to round this out by saying all of this is obviously easier said than done, because the way that I'm breaking it down is more rational. Anxiety is obviously a lot more emotional than that. But I think the underlying theme here is just to take a step back and try to distance yourself from the thoughts and the emotions a little bit and see if there's action that you can take to quiet your mind. And then if you feel as though you've already done that or you can't do that in some capacity, then my recommendation, and the reason why I call my brand Get Out of Your Head, is to say like, hey brain, I appreciate the thoughts. I know they're going to keep coming, but they're not useful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my own agency to decide to not focus on those thoughts and go do something else entirely. I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to go for a walk, connect with friends, call a loved one, something like that. And then hopefully I can get my mind off of those thoughts, stop the momentum associated with them, and then eventually find some of that clarity through my actions.
As you were just speaking, like the visual that I got from that was there's a play happening and there are puppets being used by strings, and somebody is orchestrating all of the movements and how our behaviors are happening. And then you're saying step away from our emotions. I think about step behind the curtains and see what emotions are making the behavior respond the way it is. And then your brand about, get out of your head is just the pause and not increasing the momentum of the questions and the scenarios. You've developed the mental health toolkit in your book series. Can you walk us through some key strategies and tools that listeners can start implementing to navigate through that clarity?
Yeah, so this is all of this stuff is relatively broad, right? So I try to unpack it in a way that is actionable and helpful. So how I like to think of this is, let's define kind of what a mental health toolkit is. And I think most folks will understand it, but we'll just put some words to it. So mental health toolkit, right? That's essentially a set of tactics, possibly even some strategies that you could use in the midst of anxiety or depression or some other mental health. I don't know if we could use the word crisis, but I guess I would say more of an episode, right? So if you are feeling anxious right now, what can you do to walk that fear back? The reason why I say the toolkit is broad or the answer is broad is tactics exist on sort of a ladder or a spectrum from high to low, right? So the lowest level one would be like, okay, you're anxious right now, maybe stand up and do 10 jumping jacks, right? And that's something that's super tactical, super actionable, in the moment. Today, you can do that right now. On the broader, higher level, there are more of the tactics of like, how do you reframe negative thoughts in general? How do you build your life in a way that has less stress in it, that then leads to less anxiety-provoking situations in the first place? Although all of those things, and talking about all of them, I'm obviously passionate about it, but it's also, those things are important to discuss. I think the low-level ones are what folks tend to gravitate towards more, because, right, like somebody who's listening is saying like, the next time I find myself in a panic attack or an anxiety attack, like I need something to get me out of there, And so one thing that I think would be helpful to start with is going back to the topic of our survival instincts, the sort of evolutionary psychology that drives a lot of our fear, a lot of our emotions, right? And so if you think about the fight or flight response in the body, that is essentially part of our nervous system that turns on when we are in front of a threat, right? So if we're being semantic, then by definition, that is sort of like the fear response, right? We're in that haunted house where somebody pops out in front of us and we run as quickly as possible. Anxiety is, as we mentioned, is very similar to that, but it's missing that immediacy, right? It's saying, okay, I'm more worried about being in that haunted house a month from now. The difficulty there is when we are in front of a real live threat and we feel that fear, we take action, right? So the body is trained or is programmed to do that. So we get in front of a real live lion and that thing starts growling at us or roaring at us. We might play dead. We might run for our lives. At the very least, our hearts are going to be racing, our palms are going to be sweating. And even though being in front of a lion would be a horrendous thing that none of us want to go through, the simplicity of it is that it is fight or it is flight, right? And we get out of there and we move on from that situation, whether we live or we don't. The difficulty with anxiety is that the action piece, because the timeline is larger, and that threat or that perceived threat is further away, we are distanced from the action, right? So when I was talking about the exam, if we're taking a math exam, the difficulty is you can't look a math exam in the face and be like, I'm either going to fight with you right now or I'm going to run away, right? Instead, you're like, you just have these fears and these questions and this negativity of what if, what might happen next. So the difficulty with that is, we need to essentially get back to the action-oriented piece if possible. So what does that mean, right? I think this is obviously a little complicated, but one last thing I'll say on this subject is, when we are stressed out and we're scared, our bodies are flooded with cortisol and adrenaline and neurotransmitters and that sort of thing, right? And the further away we are from the stressor or the anxiety-provoking thing, the more, or at the very least, the longer timeline we have for the adrenaline to kick in, the cortisol to, keep surging, the neurotransmitters to keep pumping out, and that sort of thing, which means that we can often build up a lot of those different molecules in our brains and in our bodies. Typically what happens is, right, so adrenaline and cortisol, those would kick in to be like a signal to say, run for your life. The difficulty is we don't have the stimulus in front of us to say, do that same action, run, right? So that's the difficulty of the difference between a lion and a math exam, right? If the math exam were a lion, we would run. The difficulty is when that math exam is in front of us, like, it's just a piece of paper. It's very scary. It might come along with, ramifications and all sorts of negative externalities or side effects or whatever, but the math exam itself, like the piece of paper, cannot actually kill us, you know what I mean? So to round this all back out and finally get to what I was trying to say in the first place is, even though that math exam or some other stimulus that we have off in the distance in our calendars on the timeline, even though we can't fight or flight that thing, so to speak, we still, like, our brains and our bodies are still programmed to do that sort of thing. And so one of the reasons that exercise is so effective in the treatment or the mitigation of anxiety is we are basically, when we say, hey, I'm confronted with some scary thing that's off in the distance, aka the anxiety response, if I'm exercising, I am taking action as though that thing is that lion, even though it is not. And so one of the things that I like to tell folks is, all right, before anything else, right, get back into your body, get out of your head, try to essentially burn off or flush the adrenaline, the cortisol, the neurotransmitters out of your body as if you were responding to a real, in-your-face, life or death threat, right? And so what that can help us do is, okay, we go for a walk, we lift some weights, we go for a run, we do 10 jumping jacks, we do push-ups. We may be able to flush out that response of adrenaline and cortisol and neurotransmitters in the body, which then tells the brain, okay, I have done what you asked me to do, therefore, please have mercy on me and turn off the anxiety response. So that can be effective. I know that was a mouthful, so I want to pause there.
That was very actionable because it's anxiety in theory. It's, of a meditation, and the way you're framing it is you have this adrenaline, use it for something good, and then revisit the problem. So now we are moving from that amygdala, that fight or flight, to our prefrontal cortex, what allows us to reason, to rationalize, and to think a little bit clearer. So mental health is often misunderstood. What are some myths about anxiety and depression that you wish more people realized weren't true?
Yeah, I mean, the first one that we're talking about right now already, without putting a name to it, right, is the notion that anxiety is a weakness, right? And that mental health, challenges or struggles are weaknesses as well. The reason I say we're talking about it already is we've talked a lot about scientific facts and phenomena in our bodies, right? And so when people say, oh, like that person gets anxious, or I deal with anxiety, like, I am lesser for having experienced that, or I am weak for having experienced that, I often say to people, the reframe on this is, yes, anxiety is very painful. It's very difficult. I'm not saying it's a good thing. What I am saying is that it's literally not a weakness. It's actually the complete opposite. It is your body trying to protect itself. It is a survival mechanism. I don't see survival mechanisms as weaknesses. Now, we could get into semantics and say, hey, maybe, it's that mechanism is misplaced or obsolete these days, or it's just not helpful. Sure, I'll give you that. But when you really boil it down and you say this is a survival mechanism first and foremost, I think you can make that reframe a lot easier and say, if it were actually a weakness, it would be like, I think I probably wouldn't survive. My body wouldn't be trying to do these things. And so even though, again, it's not helpful a lot of the times, or it's very painful, remember that anxiety is just your body trying to protect you. And if you think about going to a job interview or a first date or doing something that scares you, that fear or that anxiety comes from those questions and those possibilities of what might happen if something occurs, right? So if I go to a job interview and they laugh me out of the room, or I don't get a job offer or something like that, how am I going to respond, right? The anxiety feeds off of that thought process. And so again, even though it's not helpful and it's kind of painful, it's certainly not a weakness, because what's happening is your body is trying to prepare you for those outcomes. Now, what I would say is basically what is probably more helpful is to say, I appreciate you trying to do that pre-planning for me, but me actually focusing on those negative outcomes leads me toward them more readily than me not thinking about them at all. And so I think one of the cut-through messages that is helpful and sort of uplifting is understanding that even though we have this evolutionary programming that is sort of running the show, as you mentioned, David, we do have our prefrontal cortices as well. And those are the parts of our brains that are responsible for critical thinking and planning and taking action, right? And so if we get, if we're able to put our bodies into motion a little bit, go for a run, do some push-ups, whatever, and mitigate that amygdala response a little bit and then get back into our prefrontal cortices, we can bring agency back into the process. We can get out of our heads and say, I'm taking action, I'm doing things that are gonna benefit me toward, making these different goals and dreams that I have in my heart or in my mind or whatever come to fruition. And so I know I kind of went off track a little bit, but I think just to recap, right? A lot of people will say that anxiety is a weakness when in reality, it is just your brain and your body trying to protect itself. If we go one step further and we say, hey, thank you so much, I totally appreciate that, but I have other things that I want to achieve here, we can not only kind of use that survival mechanism to our advantage, but we can then also, try to bring our dreams and goals closer to fruition, right? A lot of people will sometimes say, hey, if you're in an athletic competition, you might be scared, and that is challenging, difficult, frustrating, but if you can harness that energy that's coursing through your veins, you might even run a little bit faster or throw the discus a little bit further, that sort of thing. So I'm all about trying to reframe things in a way that is positive, fully knowing that anxiety, depression, mental health, this is all very challenging stuff, but we got to do the best that we can and play the cards that we're dealt.
I like how you reframe that as anxiety is not a weakness, it's a survival mechanism, and not also pacifying, because there's a lot of narratives and conversations where people are nurturing and romanticizing, oh, I have anxiety, but you're saying like to recognize it, to think it, and we're likely to get the thing that we're worried about versus reframing it and saying, okay, what steps do I need to take in order to achieve the opposite so that I'm not operating continuously out of fear. Now, I know that your message resonates with men who are struggling with mental health. Like, why do you think your message connects so well with this demographic, and how can we encourage a more open conversation about mental well-being?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I don't have like a sexy or a great answer here. I think that it mostly comes down to the content itself, right? So like my writing is filled with stories of my own experiences. Those experiences come from a guy, and so a lot of those stories will revolve around, trying to, for lack of a better word, like court a female that I'm interested in but I'm nervous about, or going skydiving or going on a job interview. And it's not like those things don't relate to women at all, but like they are told from the vantage point of a man. And so I think typically it's like, you listen to people who talk about the same things that you talk about and the things that you like. So I think just the way that I tell my stories tends to resonate with guys a little bit more. I think also though, like, my approach, like I'm trying to bring in a little bit of the masculine vibes, a little like not machismo, but like, I'm trying to show people that like it doesn't all have to be like, rainbows and unicorns, as in like we don't have to make this mental health thing super corny. And it's not me throwing shade at anybody. Like there's a time and a place for that 100%. And there are plenty of brands where that is their messaging and that works super well. But obviously there is a portion of the market, like, a certain demographic of men who are just like, I don't like that. I don't like the way that you talk about mental health in that capacity. So I'm trying to make it a little bit more real, I guess, just in the sense of like, hey, we don't have to dress it all up. We can talk about it how it is. We can give weight and gravity to the difficulty of it, right? And it's almost like I'm thinking of sort of like a seesaw in my mind, right? Is we want to make it so that this is approachable, as in like it's not overbearing, but at the same time it's not that cheesiness, because I think a lot of guys are like, oh, I'm not going to talk about my emotions, that's lame or whatever. I'm trying to present it in a way that is just real and authentic and not, I'm not dressing it up. I'm not glamorizing it. I'm not romanticizing it. I think you used that term earlier and that was great. Just trying to present it how it is and be like, listen, dudes, like we can have a real conversation about this. Like we can take the walls down. It's not a big deal. We don't have to, make it this big movie production kind of like larger than life kind of thing. We can just talk about it.
It's profound. And if our listeners are resonating with this content today, how can they get connected with you, Brian?
Yeah, I would just go to getoutofyourhead.com. So that's my website. On Instagram, the handle is getoutofyourhead. Also, no dashes, no spaces in either of those. There's like a contact form on the website, and obviously you can send a DM on Instagram. So yeah, definitely reach out in those capacities. Like, love to hear from folks, no matter if it's positive or negative. Like, and I mean that in the sense of if somebody had a profound experience with my work or just had a breakthrough in their own life unrelated to what I do, like unrelated to me being involved. And also if somebody is struggling and they want to reach out and they're looking for guidance or help or resources or whatever, like I'm here to help in any capacity that I can. That's kind of the ethos and the impetus behind the brand. So yeah, definitely please don't hesitate to reach out.
And your insight into mental health, clarity, resilience is truly impactful. Your Get Out of Your Head framework provides a powerful roadmap for those struggling with anxiety. And I know our listeners are going to walk away with some actionable tools and steps towards a clearer, more healthier mindset. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it.
To our listeners, if you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. You can connect with Brian at getoutofyourhead.com. Until next time, stay clear, stay inspired, and keep designing your life with intention.